Okay, this is the lecture on chapter 25 of our AMSCO textbook. It's lecture 6 for week 4 of our summer class together. I think I was mistakenly calling the lecture I did in class today lecture 4. It's actually lecture 5. I don't know what that's about, but clear it up. Doesn't matter. It all goes in order anyway. It's a longer one, but it's about World War II. It's not as long as World War II, so it's not even as long as, an hour on the landing at Normandy. So, could be worse. We'll go through and look at the lead up to the war, the actual ideologies that are at play, the war itself, some of the key battles, and I'll go quickly through it. We don't need to belabor the actual fighting in Europe. I want to try to focus more on the domestic front, but it is important. Unlike World War I, where the United States doesn't have a major, a significant hand in it. I mean, they're there, but only for a short amount of time. World War II, the United States does play a key role in winning, along with the Soviet Union. So it's important to go over it. So I'll try to go quickly here. First, a little bit of nomenclature. I've talked before about how the term liberal is not appropriate to use when we're talking about people from the late 19th century. Andrew Carnegie is a liberal in the sense that, right, he wants free trade, no government regulation. That's what the term liberal meant up until this time period, the 1940s. So liberal used to mean what we would now call libertarian. And that happens in this time period. The Democrats create what's called the New Deal Coalition. It is the progressives, who we learned about a few lectures ago. It is Southerners, both white and black. White Southerners because they've already been Democrats. They've always had been Democrats. And black Southerners because the New Deal Coalition under Roosevelt actually does does a lot of things that are not helpful to them. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, for example, kicks tenant farmers off of their land, unintended consequence. The Homeowners Loan Corporation doesn't give loans to black families, but it does offer jobs programs, jobs training, and avenues to employment that were not previously there. So you have black Southerners starting to vote Democrat, which would have been unthinkable even 20 years before. And you have Northern white ethnics. These are the ones that benefit most from a lot of these programs, getting put back to work, getting good union jobs because unions are legal, getting higher wages because of collective bargaining, having the ability to buy a home for the first time, all of this stuff. So that is the New Deal Coalition. Republicans are isolationist, pro-business, centered in the Northeast. So in this regard, Republicans are very similar to, Whig policies or Federalists, people who want tariffs, want industry supported, largely centered in the Northeast. That is more the Republican model. By 1936 here, the term, and again, this is what I started talking about here, term liberal means someone who supports the New Deal, and conservative means a critic. So this is where we get our modern nomenclature, the idea that a liberal is someone who is a moderate Democrat, and someone who's conservative is a Republican. Again, the term liberal sometimes is used incorrectly now to mean anything left of center. But Hillary Clinton is not the same as Bernie Sanders. Hillary Clinton we would consider a liberal or even kind of conservative liberal, where someone like Bernie Sanders is more progressive. And then if you go further, you get more radical, right? So there's shades to this stuff, but in broad strokes, it's the terminology we use nowadays. Okay, before the war, FDR recognizes the USSR. This is a first since the Russian Revolution in 1917. Remember, Woodrow Wilson supported the other side of the Russian Civil War in the 1920s. He lost on that bet. So Roosevelt recognizes the USSR. Roosevelt, with the good neighbor policy, recognizes more Latin American sovereignty, says we are going to enter into negotiations with Latin America as equals, not as a dominant force, our way or the highway type thing. He is harder on Japan. He continues the doctrine under Hoover of the Stimson Doctrine, which doesn't recognize the territory that Japan is taking over in mainly Manchuria. So Japan had taken over the Korean Peninsula in 1905 to 1910. But their invasion of Manchuria is not recognized by Hoover, and it continues to not be recognized by FDR. Continues to be isolationist. Most Americans don't want to go to war, right? They just think that that North America is a different place altogether. European problems are our problems. Naive, certainly naive, but that's the way a lot of people feel. Just because it's not right doesn't mean a majority of people don't think it. The America First Committee, this is our own little homegrown fascist organization. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe they are. If you look at the track record, it's pretty clear that a lot of anti-Semitic comments. They don't want to get involved in the war. They're so isolationist that they effectively are supporting Germany in the sense that when Germany is building up their military and threatening England, and people are saying we should help England to help counter this rising fascism in Germany, when you say let's not get involved, you're effectively giving support to the bully, the aggressor, Germany. And that was the case with America First. The critiques of America First, again, here you see that they're two sides of the same, kind of belt. America First and Nazism. And then on the right here, you have a Dr. Seuss cartoon. Dr. Seuss is a famous Antifa, I guess is the dumb phrase we would use now. He is anti-fascist because fascists are bad. Dr. Seuss is anti-fascist and made actually a lot of anti-fascist cartoons. He's no saint himself. He's not great on issues of race when it comes to Asians. But he doesn't like fascism either. And what is fascism? We see here a faccio, which is a bundle. This is a Roman symbol. It's also a symbol of early American republicanism. Remember, the early republic got a lot of their ideas from Rome and Roman democracy, the Roman Republic. So you will see a lot of like faccio symbols in American iconography. But remember that in the late 1700s, fascism doesn't exist yet. So they're borrowing these things as a sign of republicanism, not as a sign of like low-key fascism or something, right? It's an authoritarian regime. It places the good of the nation above all else, including your individual rights. So you sacrifice yourself for the good of the nation, for the greater good. Aggressive state ruled by a dictator. It's always a dictator. In this case, right, Mussolini, Hitler. Japan's a little different. It's not really fascism, but effectively it kind of is anyway, militaristic. Hirohito was a dictator. They make all the singular decisions, and they work closely with industry to enrich the state and control workers. So this is where, like, in contemporary discourse, you'll hear idiots saying that fascism is the same thing as communism, and communism is the same thing as fascism. It's just not true. The theory of fascism is that you have a totalitarian leader that controls everything. The theory of communism is you don't have that, right? The idea of communism is actually that you give all the power to the workers. Now, of course, Joseph Stalin doesn't do that. Joseph Stalin certainly has more in common with Hitler than he does with any kind of worker-controlled state. But the point of fascism is repression of the people. The point of communism is not supposed to be that. Patriarchy plays a big role. Racism plays a big role. You need to have, again, just like you need a strong man leader, the men in a fascist society take more power over women. The father figure takes more power. So it's almost like the state is the family writ large. A strong man who controls everything, makes all the decisions. And it's also inherently racist in that you always need some other thing that is the excluded right? The thing that you want to push out of society, the unwanted part of society. That's a key element of fascism. Fascism isn't cool. Fascism is for losers. It's for losers who don't have enough faith in their own, or aren't self-confident enough to want to feel empowered. They want to sell out that to a strongman leader and to a very rigid social hierarchy that places you as a cog in the wheel, and that makes some people feel good. But as we'll see, it was a loser in the 1930s, and it's a loser now. Just ask Benito Mussolini, hanging out here catching some fresh air on the Piazza Loreto. This is Mussolini at the end of his time, as you could imagine, in Italy, not the beginning. 1922, the good old days for Mussolini. He leads a march on Rome. He, through political machinations, takes power in Italy, declares himself Il Duce, the leader of a totalitarian state. He uses threats, violence, political skill to kind of be the singular leader. Mussolini, much like Hitler, moderates thought that they were both kind of jokes, kind of comical populist figures, and they thought that they could use moderate politicians, moderate and conservative, center-right politicians, thought that they could use these populist leaders to get their own agenda passed. When it turns out the joke was on them, the populist leaders actually were more popular than they imagined, and they moderate and center-right leaders in both Italy and Germany find themselves forced out of government positions, even though they opened the door for both Mussolini and Hitler. Uses military power to rally the nation. Again, for Mussolini, what he wants to recreate, obviously, is Rome. He uses, right, that's why fascism is originally a Italian ideology. It's fascio, right? It has all of this Roman stuff. 1922, Hitler is, he hasn't even gone to jail the first time yet. So Hitler's nobody in 1922. There's no fascism in Germany. Mussolini comes to power a full 15 years before Hitler even is anything. So he wants to build up the military and kind of become Rome again. In order to do that, he invades Ethiopia, the only independent African state. That's in 1935 he does that. Germany has to come in and bail him out. Turns out that the Italians aren't actually that good at fighting. And time and again, whether it's Greece or in Ethiopia, the Germans come in and bail them out when they start to lose. Doesn't stop them from committing war crimes, gassing, using gas to kill Ethiopian civilians en masse. Obviously, there's a racial element to this, a racist element to this. They initially don't want to, like, eugenic racism and anti-Semitism isn't a thing. They're perfectly happy just discriminating against Jews and Romani and others. However, they start to become more in line with the fascists after 1938 and the Nuremberg laws, and start shipping Jewish Italians and others out of Italy to Germany in order to be killed in the death camps in Germany and in Eastern Europe. This meme is no longer, this is stale, I guess, at this point, but, you get it. A good Mussolini joke is always a good Mussolini joke. Il Duce. Little Adolf. Little Adolf Hitler, in 1923, he tries to overthrow the Weimar government. So again, going back here, 1922, 1925, Mussolini's the leader in Rome, or in Italy. In 1923, he goes, little Adolf goes to jail. When he gets out, he re-enters politics. So he's way behind the game in terms of his political trajectory compared to Mussolini's. He promises to rebuild the German economy, the military, the national pride. Like Mussolini, he intimidates the opposition, takes on the title of Führer, or leader, and introduces various fascist policies, wage controls, public works, mass rallies, a budget that is in the end, almost exclusively dedicated to, 75% of their budget is dedicated to the military at one point. It's a lot of money. And they encourage fascist culture, anti-Semitism, most famously or infamously in 1938 with Kristallnacht. This is considered by many scholars the beginning of the Holocaust, when Jewish citizens, Jewish businesses are outwardly targeted for violence. So Jews in Germany had been discriminated against, but this is the first time that it's kind of out and out the policy of the government to do it. Meanwhile, in Japan, this has been a long time coming. Japan has been building up its military since the Meiji Restoration. That's in the 1860s. They tap into all the samurai, Bushido, myth-making culture, and scientific racism. Again, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Japanese claiming that they are the kind of like the European equivalents of Asia, the white people of Asia, and they are genetically superior. So these are all pretenses for expansion. They have the Manchurian Incident, which is effectively a staged attack on Japanese forces. It's a false flag, as it were. That gives them the pretense for invading Manchuria. And also the Anti-Comintern Pact, which is the Anti-Communist International Pact. Japan, along with Germany, along with Italy, and along with then fascist Spain, get together and they say, we are going to fight against the spread of communism. And before World War II happens, that's a fairly appealing ideology to England, to France, and to the United States, because these countries are more afraid of communism than they are of fascism. So the United States, England, France are perfectly happy to have this other ideology called fascism, which is all about fighting communism, right? It basically does what these liberal democracies would like to do, but are unable to do because they're liberal democracies, right? You can't just have like a strong man and like invest all your money in the military when you are, a liberal democracy. But Japan can, Spain can, Germany can, Italy can. So the idea of anti-communism is a big selling point here. And Japan says they're anti-imperialist. Right, so when Japan comes in, so here's Japan, here's Korea, here's Manchuria. When Japan comes in and liberates the Philippines and French Indochina, they're saying, look, fellow Asians, we're helping you throw off the imperial shackles of the French or the British or whomever. They don't say that like they're going to be throwing on the shackles of Japanese imperialism, but ostensibly they say, we're here to liberate you. Not so much. Meanwhile, in Spain, there is a civil war, the nationalists versus the Republicans. The nationalists are the fascist, right? In Spain, it's the Falangists or Falangistas. They are also Catholics, supporters of the Catholic Church, and Carlists, or supporters of the royal family. These are the more conservative elements. They are the nationalists, supported by the Germans. While on the other side is the Republicans, and the Republicans are a mix of socialists, anarchists, and other kind of pro-democracy movements, effectively all movements that want to put power in the hands of the people in various different ways, right? So socialism, anarchism, communism are all different ideologies, but they're ideologies that, when it comes to fighting fascism, they all agree that they're against it. You can have debates about the difference between socialism, anarchism, and communism, but again, when there's a fascist to fight, they get together and they participate. They lose. The Republicans lose. The fascists win. Again, with the help of German air power mainly, bombing the Republican positions. They win and they stay in power until 1975. The fascists in Spain do. So a long, long time. They stay out of, mainly because they stay out of World War II. Had they joined in World War II on the side of the Italy and Germany, they would have been all done for. The Spanish Civil War is seen, again, as a reason to militarize. The spirit of anti-communism in the time period says, yeah, this is see what will happen if you don't try to stop fascism. You're going to have anarchists and socialists wanting to take over your country and give all the power in the hands of the workers, and you don't want that to happen. You know, Hitler does kind of low-key sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin, but more on that later, even though he's very much against communism. Okay. 1933. Hitler promises to restore German greatness. This is from the Modern World textbook, phrases it as such. So this is not some low-key political dig. That is actually a quote from the Modern World or in Pattern's textbook. That's what Germany's trying to do. Hitler's trying to do. He wants to create what's called Lebensraum, living space. I always think of that, you know, that living spaces, that ad that's on the radio or whatever. It literally translates to Lebensraum. So I always think of Lebensraum when I hear that commercial for what living spaces. Well, I don't know. They sell couches or something. I don't even know. Anyway, living space. This is the reason they need to invade all this land. It's almost like, you know, it's like manifest destiny for Germany, except they've got a bunch of other countries around them. They need space to spread out, or elbow room, as the Schoolhouse Rock cartoon would have it. That's why they need to invade Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss, and then eventually Poland. They sign a treaty with Britain allowing new naval construction. Treaty of Versailles says you're not supposed to do that. They also send troops into the Rhineland. Treaty of Versailles says you're not supposed to do that. France, well, definitely England, and then France to a lesser degree, they allow Germany to do this because, again, they're more afraid of communism than they are of the Germans. Once Germany invades the Rhineland, which is on the west side of Germany, the border with France, then it becomes kind of clear that, like, maybe this isn't about fighting communism, right? They would be building up forces on the east side of Germany if it was about that. They eventually do that. They annex Austria, which is known as the Anschluss. This is the background to The Sound of Music. So if you're familiar with The Sound of Music, that's the Anschluss. So that is what's happening there. The Austrians speak German. Germans speak German. So conservative Austrians welcome this. Obviously, liberal and left-leaning Austrians and Austrian nationalists don't. Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier let him do this. They let Hitler invade the Sudetenland, which is half of Czechoslovakia. We will watch a video about this in class tomorrow, which you can click on yourself if you have the lecture on Canvas, but we'll watch it in class. Winston Churchill opposes all of this. Turns out Churchill was right. Shouldn't have let Hitler do all this bad stuff. Okay, World War II begins in Europe. What starts it is the invasion of Poland. Britain and France declare war quickly. Germany, with the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, invades Poland very, very quickly. Spring 1940, they invade Denmark and Norway. This gives them more access to ports. It also gives them more access to be able to start a war against England. We'll look at a map in class to make sense of that if you're not familiar with European geography, why Germany controlling Denmark and Norway would help them in attacking England. They move quickly through the Netherlands and Belgium, and then they attack through the Ardennes forest. France builds this massive thing called the Maginot Line between France and Germany, and Germany goes right around it. So again, bad call there on France's part. World War II begins in Europe. Part 2. France surrenders pretty quickly. They set up a Vichy government in the south of France, which is pro-German. It's basically a puppet state. This is something that's very important to remember when we're studying this time period. Yeah, Germany is lousy with Nazis, obviously, but there's other people in other parts of Europe that sympathize with that ideology. There's plenty of people in France that are anti-Semitic. There's plenty of people in France that really hate communists. And there's plenty of people in France that think workers have too many rights and they should just shut up and get in line and make the state more powerful. And that's the way to go, right? The kind of toady ideology. So yeah, there's plenty of people in the south of France, which is more conservative, more Catholic, more traditional. They're happy to set up a kind of pro-Nazi government. Doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other French people who fight in the resistance, and there are many that do fight in the French resistance. Battle of Britain begins between August and October. This is the bombing of urban centers. This is where we get the original keep calm and carry on. These were the propaganda posters placed around London. Basic, very, very English, just telling people to just just chill out. Don't freak out about it. Just keep calm and carry on. Very English response to being bombed almost nightly. It is a weird time period in that on the one hand, they have these new technologies like radar, which can see these missiles coming into London. Missiles didn't exist in World War I, so the V2 rocket is a German technology. They're not super accurate, but their lack of accuracy makes them even more terrifying, in that they can get pretty close to where they want to go. This is a new technology. On the other side of things, radar is a new technology that can see these rockets, but at the same time, they do old school things like turning the lights off. This would be to prevent bombings from planes, right? Planes dropping bombs on London. Everyone goes into the subway, things like that. 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and that's where you done goofed. Napoleon made the mistake of doing it. They made the mistake in World War I. Germany made the mistake of doing it, and they done did it again in World War II. Here is a political cartoon about the non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. Stalin, the blushing bride. And here is the image on the left is photoshopped. I don't think Stalin ever did that. But the image on the right is a meme I made a couple of years ago. Stalin certainly regretted the deal once Hitler invaded. Stalin has the last laugh, but not after 20 million Soviet citizens and soldiers die in fighting in the quote-unquote the East, which is obviously the West for Russia. In the Pacific, Japan is liberating all of these colonial possessions. By liberating French Indochina, the U.S. leaders respond by banning the export of oil to Japan. Japan responds December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, by bombing Pearl Harbor. Lots of people die, lots of aircraft destroyed. Congress declares war on Japan the next day. As I mentioned during one of your presentations just yesterday, Claudia Rankine, first female congressperson from Montana. Claudia Rankine was the only congressperson to vote no on a declaration of war. She lost her seat, her congressional seat for it, right? We paid at the polls, as they say, but certainly stood on principle because she was a pacifist. Meanwhile, the home front, we will look at this image a little bit more in class, the Zoot Suit riots. This is white servicemen attacking, beating up young Zoot Suiters. That you see here on the right was a style of dress in the 1940s. Big jacket, baggy pants, things like that. U.S. servicemen, white servicemen, many of them from the South. They were used to having people of color, obviously for the most part black Americans in the southern United States, not talk back, step out of the way when they walk down the street, not be in the same movie theater as them. So when they go on shore leave from Long Beach and Los Angeles, the ports, and they see these young Mexican Americans and also African Americans, out in the street, talking back when, racial slurs are thrown at them, imagine. They get very angry and they beat up these Zoot Suiters. It's a couple days of rioting, largely white on U.S. white servicemen against these Latino Chicano Zoot Suiters. We'll talk about this a little bit. The Zoot Suiters are also seen as unpatriotic, primarily because they wore baggy clothes. That sounds weird, but we can talk about it in class if you'd like to. And here's some more images. In the corner, they would rip the clothing off of the Zoot Suiters. Here's a bunch of young people who were arrested. Obviously, these are also the victims of the attacks. Women were also involved in the Zoot Suit culture. They were what the term would be pachucas, the female equivalent of a Zoot Suiter. And again, they wore their hair in a certain way. They wore a certain kind of makeup, a certain kind of skirt that identified them as a kind of youth counterculture. Also, Southern California and California in general, Japanese Americans. The Japanese in the United States and Japanese Americans have a very unique kind of community in that specific immigration restrictions go in place in 1907 and in 1924 that create a community that is either in the Japanese Issei, which is first generation, right? These are people born in Japan who would have been old by the 1930s, and then the Nisei, which is the second generation or US born. So it's not as though you have people from Japan that are 70 and 60 and 20 and 12. You have older Issei immigrants that got here before the immigration restrictions were put in place. And then you have their kids and grandkids. There's a third generation. I don't know what the third generation is, but the Nisei is the second generation. So it's a very distinct community. They are fairly conservative. They are upwardly mobile, middle class business owners, upper middle class. They publish Japanese language dailies. There's all kinds of industries that they're in: food service, publishing, all kinds of stuff. The Executive Order 9906 is the Japanese internment order, which relocates 110 to 120,000 from the West Coast. 62% of these people are U.S. citizens, right? So these are people who were born in the United States, and because of the 14th Amendment and the Wong Kim Ark decision in the late 1880s, they are U.S. citizens. Obviously, this is a very bad blemish on the Roosevelt administration. Fanboys of FDR frequently omit Executive Order 9906 from their retelling of the FDR's glories. Interesting, though, Japanese Hawaiians are excluded. 40% of the Hawaiian population is Japanese or Japanese American. So it's interesting in the sense that what is Japanese internment really about? There's Japanese people living in New York. They don't get sent to internment camps. There's Japanese in Chicago. They don't get sent to internment camps. And you have 40% of Hawaii is also Japanese or Japanese American, and they're not sent to internment camps. So what in the world is this about? You would get a sense when we look at the next image here. It is only Japanese in what is known as the exclusion zone or exclusion area, which is Washington, half of Washington and Oregon, and all of California, and then parts of southern Arizona. The reason, right, historians argue, and the record proves them right, the reason why people in Hawaii were not relocated and elsewhere were not relocated is the racism of the time period influenced West Coast politicians a lot. So a lot of West Coast politicians were very anti-Japanese, and a lot of West Coast politicians were anti-Japanese because big agriculture, white-run agricultural concerns were very anti-Japanese. A lot of these Japanese Americans were quite successful in agriculture or in food sales or distribution, and they had always been seen as a threat. I mean, since the late 1890s, they'd been seen as a threat to white agricultural concerns. And they finally, right, with Executive Order 9906, they basically just get rid of them all. Right? So all of the Japanese in this area are sent to camps where they're not over here and they're not over here. This is a picture of Manzanar. This is the one that's closest maybe to us in Southern California. It's on your way up. If you go up to Mammoth, Mammoth, you'll see it on the left-hand side of the freeway if you're driving north. Definitely worth stopping. Very, very good exhibit. It pulls no punches. It's very tough to kind of like go through and see what actually happened. But the Japanese Americans were, again, American citizens. They try to show their patriotism. Famously, right, Japanese Americans sign up to fight in World War II or fight or be translators. Doesn't mean that they get out any earlier. So after internment, only about a sixth of the internees remain. A lot of them moved to other parts of the country, because often their property was, had been taken over. And it's interesting to see, depends on who took it over. Black Americans, for example, move into Little Tokyo in Los Angeles and then are forced out by the Japanese when they're returning. Palos Verdes, on the other hand, what is now a kind of huge suburban sprawl of the Palos Verdes Peninsula that was almost exclusively Japanese farmland before World War II, and they do not get that land back. Palos Verdes is bought up by white real estate investments and is sold to, right, again, as I said in the last lecture, racially exclusive subdivisions, right, white only. So the Japanese can come back and displace African Americans, but they can't come back and displace, right, the residents of Palos Verdes. Finally, in the 1980s, the government, Ronald Reagan actually, signs the Japanese American Redress or Civil Liberties Act, which gives $22,000. That's in 1980 money, or 1984, I think, money, to each surviving internee. It's 82,000 plus checks each. Okay, so there's that. So World War II. This is again, Sound of Music, fascists, not good. Von Trapp knows it. Everyone else should know it. Why are they not good? Well, the Holocaust, for one reason. Again, we've talked about scientific racism. Scientific racism has its apex in the Holocaust. The idea that you can scientifically prove that one race is better than another doesn't lead to good results. The Holocaust is unique in that it uses technology, right? The gas chambers and other kind of high-tech methods to commit genocide. Genocides have been, you've taken patterns. You took AP World. You know that genocides are nothing new. What makes the Holocaust different is this combination of a scientific, quote-unquote, basis for the genocide, the technological means of engaging in genocide, and fascism, an ideology that wants genocide, right? Kind of part of the point of it is that certain races are inferior and you need to do something about them. And as the Nazis said, right, the final solution is to get rid of them, right? And that's exactly what the Nazis do here. In the background is an image of German soldiers. German soldiers were forced to watch video of the camps that when they were liberated. So they find dozens of concentration camps, the Allies do, they had people in the camps as early as the early 1930s. There is initially, if you want to get technical, there was a distinction between labor camps and extermination camps. Labor camps were like forced labor, where extermination camps, the point was just to kill people, right? You have the numbers here, right? All of the many people killed. And then this image here is a infamous and very tragic instance of America, or the United States, continuing its anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish sentiment that we learned about already. 1920s, 1930s, very anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish. A ship of refugees fleeing Germany makes it all the way to New York Harbor and is turned around and sent back to Hamburg because the politicians don't want these Jewish Germans and Eastern Europeans to come to the United States. Many of them are then sent to death camps. So again, a tragic instance in which the United States was not some utopia, but rather held also anti-Semitic viewpoints, which affected the lives of these refugees. Wasn't just Jewish Germans and Eastern Europeans that are targeted. Here's a picture of Romani, or to use the what is now a racist term, gypsy, Again, you use a term long enough in a pejorative or negative way, it becomes a slur, and that's what happened with the word gypsy. The technical term is Romani, which isn't associated with the long racist past of anti-Romani rhetoric in Europe primarily, but also in the United States. And then on the right is a German newspaper that reads 60,000 German marks is what this person with a hereditary illness cost the community in his lifetime. Fellow citizens, that is your money too. Effectively saying another group of people that should be eliminated is people with hereditary illnesses, disabilities, physical or cognitive disabilities. People were also sent to camps. Because again, the German citizens want to be a master race, and you can't be a master race with what they would call hereditary illness. I mean, we know it doesn't work that way, that it's not, you don't just inherit some of these things. Some of these things are genetic, and other things are not. So that's that. So that's the Nazis. They lose. Germany is divided up into different occupation zones. Between U.S., Britain, France, and USSR. A process of denazification happens. Here you have the famous explosion of the swastika on top of the Reichstag by Allied forces. And what denazification is that Allies get rid of all of the Nazi stuff, all of the remnants of the Nazi Party. That people who were in charge of the Nazi Party are tried and convicted in the Nuremberg trials. Party officials are removed from office. They cannot be politicians anymore. Textbooks are altered. Nazi symbols and propaganda are outlawed. And it's even now, right? You can't, even now, swastikas are illegal in Germany. And people are very, very introspective about the Nazi regime. There was an article in the New York Times just the other day that was interesting about the Nazi Party was a militarized party, but they also had very, very close connections with not just the military, but local police. So local police units in Germany were tied into the Nazi Party and were really on the front lines of finding Jewish citizens and others and rounding them up and sending them to the concentration camps. And one of the things now that German police go through is they go through a extensive training about that history, right? Basically take a whole history course on the relationship between the German police in the 1930s and 40s and the Nazi Party and all the terrible things they did. They go to concentration camps and go on tours so that they're very, very conscious of the power that they have, and that, you know, when that power is misused, what can happen. It was actually a very interesting article about all of the training that these police go through. So all that to say, Germany still knows Nazism is bad, right? They know that it leads to bad results. And it's interesting from a comparative perspective that the United States after the Civil War does not go through a comparative process of, you know, de-Confederate or anti-Confederate policies. Yes, Reconstruction, but Reconstruction never had any teeth anyway. The North wasn't that into it. But one can imagine had the United States actually committed to a process of ridding the remnants of racial supremacy and slave ideology, you know, things would have been potentially different in the post-war and indeed even into the modern time period. The lasting effects of denazification is changes German constitutions. They really abandon this ideology. It's not cool to be a Nazi. That sadly is changing. In Germany, far-right parties are emerging now more and more. So that's not good news. But we are in a time where far-right ideologies globally are on the rise. So that's, you know, to be determined, right? This is a history class, not a psychic class, so we don't know what happens next. The United States, atomic bombs. Obviously, the United States develops one. They do it in secret. A lot of the scientists that work on the Manhattan Project were also formerly Germans working on the V2 rocket program. So that's a unsavory connection there. They learn how to split the atom. They develop the program in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Truman didn't know that this was a thing until he takes office. Then he learns about the bomb and they use it. Right, August 6, 1945, the first bomb is dropped in Hiroshima. Several days later, another bomb is dropped in Nagasaki. Both cities destroyed, 230,000 people killed instantly. Sadly, these combined, yes, it's an incredible death toll, but Hiroshima or Nagasaki on its own, the death toll of either one of them is less than the firebombing of Tokyo, which was another air campaign against the Japanese, and more people actually died in the firebombing of Tokyo than died in Hiroshima. Obviously, in a more low-tech way, but the death toll was incredible. Japanese surrender as long as they can keep an emperor. He then becomes a kind of figurehead. And that's it. So that in August of 1945 is VJ Day, or Victory Against Japan, as opposed to VE Day, which was victory in Europe. World War II ends in 1945, and we enter the post-war period, to be continued.